Hello everyone and welcome to Two Car Pros. My name is Ryan and today I'm going to show you how to replace the CV axle on a 2015 Ford Edge. Now I did the driver front CV axle on a front wheel drive Ford Edge. I know they made all-wheel drive versions, but an all-wheel drive version and front wheel drive version for the CV axles for the driver are probably the same. I would go ahead and cross-reference the parts number just to make sure it's the same unit. It might be a little longer, might be a little shorter. I'm not entirely sure on that for you, but for a front-wheel drive unit, this is exactly how it's done with the part number. As far as the passenger side goes, I had originally planned on doing that, but when the part came, it was damaged. The owner of the car didn't want to wait any longer, so they said just to send that one back and they'll just live with it, and that's their choice. But I didn't get a chance to do the passenger side. I assure you it is very similar, if not the same. The only difference is it has a little carrier bearing in between the transmission and the hub assembly, so you're gonna have to remove that and negotiate that out. But other than that, it is basically the same. All the advice applies, the know-how, the procedure is exactly the same, so this does pretty much cover the driver and passenger side for your Ford Edge. It was pretty challenging to get the lower control arm down enough out of the pinch bolt assembly, and that really required two people with two really long pry bars. I have links down below in the description for some 3-foot long pry bars that could help you out. And they're just good to have around the shop. They really make things move when you need to, and they're absolutely essential to do this repair. I'm unsure, other than removing the entire lower control arm, I'm unsure how you would do it without it. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. So in order to remove either CV axle, we're going to come underneath the vehicle while it is in the air up on jack stands, and we need to remove this skid plate here, because you can see our CV axle that is totally toasted. And it goes back into our transmission right around there. So we need to remove this so we can see what we're doing. And it looks like it's a couple of Torx fasteners. So underneath the vehicle, we can go ahead and remove all of the T27 fasteners. Looks like there's about 7 or 8 of them. And some of mine are missing. Some of yours might be missing too. They just fall out as the vehicle ages. There's supposed to be 4 up front here, and there isn't. There we go. You can remove that skid plate. So with our wheel removed, we gain access to our hub axle nut, our CV axle nut, and you can see there's a bit of rust and corrosion and stuff on there. So I'm going to spray some WD-40 in there. Hopefully makes taking it out a little bit easier. You can also use any kind of penetrating fluid you like. We're just going to let that soak for a few minutes. Now when you're removing this thing, the assembly is just going to want to turn like this. And obviously you can't get a good, grip on this nut if the entire thing is spinning. So there's 2 things you can do. Option 1, if you don't have a very long pry bar like this one's about almost 2 feet, so it gives me plenty of torque. You can have somebody hop in the driver's seat and hold the brake pedal down all the way. But I'm working alone, so I'm just going to use my nice prying implement and hold it like this while I either grab a breaker bar and push it off, break it loose, or I'm going to use my impact gun. So I'm going to grab a 32mm socket, it's a big one, hold my rotor in place, and attempt to get this off. There we go. Mine came off, that was excellent. However, if you're finding it difficult to get this bad boy off, I would use a big breaker bar, like a 2-foot one, all kinds of torque, and you'll be able to get that off no problem. Now what I want you to do with this is throw it right into the trash. They are typically one use only, and your new CV axle will come with one. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the mounting for the brake line. Don't worry, we're not opening the brake system at all. We won't need to bleed brakes or anything. We're just removing this mount so the line is more mobile, and it's a 10mm. There we go. We can get that off its mounting. See how much more mobile it is? That's going to help us out in just a minute. Before we go any further, I want to point out what a CV axle that needs replacing typically looks like. You'll see a bunch of grease thrown everywhere, and that means this boot has failed, so it has let all the grease that lubricates the parts inside out, which is obviously not good. It creates tolerances, and that's why you hear the clunky clunkies while you're driving it around. So technically you could have this rebuilt if you really wanted to, but CV axles are pretty inexpensive, brand new. I recommend just getting new ones. And it's not like you could put a new bolt on here and repack the grease, because the parts inside of the boot are most likely junk, and that's why you're hearing that clunky as you drive. Not to mention the other boot is probably on its way. As these vehicles age, the more rubber pieces become more of a problem. So we're just going to replace this whole thing. So if you suspect that your CV axle is going out and you hear the clunkies, you'll either see this boot just cake everything in grease, and it'll either be outboard like this one, or it'll be inboard towards the transmission. Typically they're outboard, but not always. So the next thing we're going to do is remove this nut and bolt. It's like a pinch bolt that holds the ball joint for the lower control arm into the wheel hub assembly. So we need to remove that and remove the lower control arm from the hub assembly. We don't need to take the lower control out. We don't need to take the lower control arm out altogether though. So the nut is an 18mm and the bolt is 15mm. So sometimes you can just buzz it off if you get lucky, but I'm gonna back up, which is why I told you that size too. Okay, save this nut and bolt. Go ahead and remove that bolt right there. Should come out nice and easy. So I've been trying like crazy to get this ball joint down from the wheelless hub assembly, and as much as I try to pry like you normally would, there's just not enough clearance to get this bit of the lower control arm down enough to where I can get it out. I'm gonna have to call for reinforcements. I really think this is a two-person job with two very long pry bars. Okay, with two people prying in two different spots on the lower control arm, we can bring it down enough to where it separates from the wheel hub assembly, and this should give us enough access to get our CV axle out. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn our rotor to the right as much as I can, and this is going to give me more room as I separate the two. And on the Ford installers thing, they say you need a special tool to like press the CV axle out of the hub. I really don't see what they're saying, because it came out pretty easily for me. Just like that. And there we go, disconnected. Alright, so where the CV axle, kind of where the end of my fingers are, meets the transmission, you'll feel a little bit of a gap there, and that is where we want to put our prying implement. And we can separate that having a catch pan ready, because usually it leaks transmission fluid when you do this. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, now that we've popped the CV axle loose, we've defeated the little clip in there, and I'll show you that in just a moment. We can grab the CV axle and gingerly negotiate it out of its home. So I have our old CV axle we just removed from the vehicle, and our brand new one that I got off the internet, and there is a link down below in the description to this bad boy. This is made by Track Motive. They do make the Ford Motorcraft ones, but they're like $200, and this one I think was $70, so quite a savings, and as far as I can tell, pretty comparable part. So the thing you want to compare is overall length, which they're the same, your spline count and grooves, make sure these are the same, and they are. And then you want to make sure that it comes with its circlip here, which this one does. And this is the little guy we were fighting earlier. Sometimes if these get like squedged out a little bit or a little more open, just kind of from factory, they're a little more difficult to get in and out. So if this was like really tough for you to pull out, that's okay. That's completely normal. Just keep at it. And we can also see how absolutely destroyed this boot is. So all the grease is out of there. This CV axle is effectively junk. You could rebuild it, but not for under the cost of this unit here. So I definitely recommend getting something new. And of course it does come with our new CV axle nut. Make sure you use the new one, throw the old one into the trash. So here is the seal where the CV axle interfaces with the transmission, and you can see ours is in really good shape. It actually looks brand new with just a little bit of transmission fluid on there, but I'm gonna go ahead and grease that seal again. Never put seals together dry. You have a really good chance of tearing them, and then they will have to replace them. Let's go ahead and put some oil dissolving grease on there. So I got my oil dissolving grease on the end of my finger, and I'm just going to grease that on the inside. Just a little bit of grease, you don't need to drown it. There we go, that looks pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my oil dissolving grease, link down below in the description, and I'm going to just put a nice thin film on this shank surface here, just so it doesn't start drying. And then I'm also going to put a bit on the inside of this lip, because that is what actually interfaces with that black seal that we lubricated just a moment ago. And again, we don't want this to start dry ever. And then also, I'm going to use some grease here where this clip is, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want it to be nice and centered. When this clip is not centered and it hangs down too far, it is actually really difficult to get in, and a lot of people get frustrated, and I mean, you even have a chance of breaking the clip. So we're going to use some grease that dissolves in oil to center it, and it is actually like dead nuts on right now, so it's ready for installation. So before we put the CV axle in, what I want to point out is right here at the end of my finger is the the fill port for the transmission. And if a bunch of fluid comes out and it's, you know, you're really concerned about the transmission level, go ahead and remove that port and add the appropriate transmission fluid until it starts coming out just like a differential would. So then we can replace our CV axle being as perpendicular as you can to the transmission. You want this to go in straight as possible. And if it's not going in, you can try twisting it just a little bit, because if the splines aren't lined up, it's not going to go in. There we go. And you want to be gentle with the seal, be nice and ginger until we get to this stage. And basically we need to fight that clip going into its home, and there's a way you do that. So the way you do that is you can use the CV axle as kind of its own hammer, just like that, until it slides right into place perfectly. So here's a little pro tip for me to use, especially if you are putting a new CV axle into a used hub like we are, is to grab a little bit of carb spray, spray it on the splines, and then grab a nice steel wool brush, or any kind of thick, bristled, firm brush, and we're just going to clean those splines up, and that's going to make installation just that much easier, especially if you live somewhere that maybe snows and, you know, there's a lot of corrosion. See, look how much I've already taken out. So go ahead and clean those up. So now we can install our CV axle into our hub, and the way you're going to do that is lift it up and away until we can position it into its home, like that. And there we go. That's as good as that's going to get for right this moment. So now we can turn our wheels straight again so we can get the lower ball joint in. And then don't pull too far on out of the CV axle. It's okay if it just kind of sits in its home. Maybe the spines don't line up exactly. So I want to put that back to the steering being straight, but don't pull on the CV axle out, because the only thing holding that in is the boot, and you really don't want that to come out. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of what we just did. So again, we're going to do our two-person pry, because it needs a lot of force to clear. There we go, and it's home. Now what I was doing while I was fighting it was rotating the CV axle so the splines fit into the hub, and that was fighting me a little bit, so rotating that back and forth until they're in their home was the key. So now we can put this pinch bolt back exactly the way we found it. So I have my torque implement, and it is loaded to 76 foot-pounds. Back up the bolt. And there we go. So we can go ahead and put on our CV axle brand new nut. Grab our 32mm socket, and I'm just going to bring that down to touch. There we go. Now I can grab my torque implement. So in order to keep the wheel assembly to stop moving while you're torquing it down, what I'm going to do is have a helper with the lug nuts on hold it just like that with a big pry bar. Alternatively, you could just have somebody in the driver's seat holding the brakes down all the way. So just grab your big torque wrench, set that bad boy to 148 foot-pounds, and get busy. All right, here we go. Big torque. There it is. Excellent. Then we're gonna grab some carburetor spray or brake clean, and we're just gonna hose off the rotor because it's got grease on there from us manipulating this thing. All right, we're gonna grab our 10mm bolt, grab our brake line, put that back into its home. Start the threads on that. And then I'm just going to tighten it down. I think the torque spec is something like 106 inch-pounds. Wrist tight is probably fine. There we go. So then we can replace our undervalance piece. There's little clips that line up into the subframe. Right there. And right there kind of helps you line the thing up. And I apologize, I don't really have a torque figure for you, but wrist tight is probably fine. And there you go. So that is how to replace a CV axle on your 2015 Ford Edge. It is a little challenging to be sure, and if you don't think you could get that lower control arm down enough, it might be worth it to take it to a shop or something like that and have that replaced there. It was pretty challenging, but if you think you can handle it, you think you're strong enough, and you got the prying implements, I say go for it, because the rest of it was a breeze. It was really easy sailing. If this video has helped you at all, consider giving it a like. It really helps the channel out, or maybe you can even subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.